Iran has been sanctions for years, and I think the most intense sanctions came during the Obama era until the JCPOA, and then Trump returned to those Obama era sanctions that were in place before the JCPOA, but that did not break Iran. And so sanctions didn't work, so Trump went to war with Iran, and now war isn't working, so he's going back to sanctions. But sanctions have been a failed strategy when it comes to Iran. Some other countries might buckle under the force of US sanctions, but Iran is not any country, and they haven't buckled.
And somebody who has written for Breakthrough News is also who we're going to be having on now for our first segment to talk about what's going on with this new economic war in Iran. That's right. The U.S. has declared economic D-Day on Iran. That's literally what they're calling it. Operation Economic Outcast. I mean, seriously, where do they come up with this crap? But this is very serious. It's a bid to try to choke Iran's economy like never before, with Washington comparing its own sanctions campaign to the Allied invasion of Normandy. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent actually coined the D-Day line himself in a Financial Times column, calling this the single greatest financial offensive ever marshaled against an adversary. And here's a clip of Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announcing it yesterday.
Today, at President Trump's direction, the United States Treasury has begun Operation Economic Outcast, an unprecedented campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran and its enablers. Our objective is to sever every economic lifeline that sustains this tyrannical regime until Tehran stands alone.
So Iran has been under U.S. sanctions for decades, but this marks a major escalation. Washington is now threatening the rest of the world if any country keeps trading or doing financial business with Iran. The problem, of course, is Iran trades with over 100 countries. In fact, its largest trading partner is China, and China has already shown no sign of falling in line. So is the U.S. actually capable of and willing to tank the global economy just to isolate Iran? And even if that were to work, does that change the military equation at all, given that Iran still holds escalation dominance and control of the Strait of Hormuz? Joining us to break it all down is Tehran-based journalist Navid Zarrinnal. Navid, welcome back to BT Live.
Rania and Zoe, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to hear your take on all this. And before I ask you the first question here, I actually want to play another clip of Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, who made this announcement yesterday. It's quite revealing. Let's go ahead and play that clip.
You described this as an economic D-Day, but D-Day wasn't a threat of an invasion, and the U.S. didn't give a timeline to Germany. So why not impose the sanctions today?
Well, we are giving everyone the opportunity to remedy bad behavior. Why would I want to blow up the global financial system? We believe that it is important to level set and give people a cure period, but they should know that that will move very quickly and that we are serious. Secondary sanctions are a very powerful tool, and we here at Treasury, this is Gene Lang, the acting Undersecretary for Terrorism Finance, and in the Terrorism Finance Department and at OFAC, the reason we are able to use secondary sanctions is because we do not take their use lightly. So we believe that a warning shot and a level set of expectations is appropriate. And if people do not want to meet our expectations, then we expect, and they should expect, that they will leave the dollar system. Okay, thank you all.
Okay, so there you have U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent essentially admitting that going further and faster with this risks blowing up the global financial system. You know, deeper economic isolation can obviously hurt Iran. It would hurt any country, but it's also a window into how this entire U.S. war on Iran has been one long string of cell phones. And just, to emphasize some of those cell phones, you had a retired four-star general who's a national security analyst for MS Now, Barry McCaffrey, recently assessed that U.S. armed forces have probably permanently lost access to 15 Persian Gulf bases, meaning that Iran is now positioned to control access to the Gulf states, and the U.S. will have to go negotiate new basing arrangements in Western Saudi Arabia, in Israel, and in Southern Europe. Meanwhile, U.S. crude inventories have fallen to roughly 41 days of refinery supply because of disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz. And for those who don't understand why that would be a problem, that's the thinnest combined commercial and strategic petroleum cushion the country has had in 4 to 5 decades. And then you've got precision-guided weapon stockpiles so depleted that the Pentagon's pulling equipment out of East Asia to keep surrounding Iran, which is a shift that's sending the China hawks in Washington into an absolute panic about what it means for their Cold War posture. And of course, the Strait of Hormuz, as you know, Navid, remains Iran's biggest card, and there's nothing the U.S. can actually do about that. So we have 6 months of war having failed to compel Iran to bend to the U.S.'s will, and now, quote unquote, severing every economic lifeline, as Washington is demanding, requires getting powerful countries like China to enforce a strategy they've already shown they're not interested in enforcing. So it seems like Washington is betting that economic strangulation can finally achieve what 6 months of war couldn't, but also demanding this level of international compliance that would be a stretch in the best of times, let alone now when U.S. relations with much of the world is becoming so coercive. So Navid, aside from hurting ordinary Iranians, after everything I just went through there, does this attempt at economic isolation, which by Scott Bessent's own admission could blow back on the U.S., does it actually change anything in Washington's favor here?
I don't think that it does. And you could even hear the lack of confidence in the US Treasury boss's voice. His voice was shaking when he was making the announcements. I mean, I don't know, maybe he had some condition, but when he was answering the question, he was a little bit more confident. But when he was making the announcement about the D-Day sanctions, he did not sound very confident and his voice was shaking. And I think what will happen is that, Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi said this earlier, that you've tried this method before and it didn't work. And if you look at the history of US-Iran relations after the 1979 revolution, Iran has been sanctions for years. And I think the most intense sanctions came during the Obama era until the JCPOA, and then Trump returned to those Obama-era sanctions that were in place before the JCPOA, but that did not break Iran. And so sanctions didn't work, so Trump went to war with Iran, and now war isn't working, so he's going back to sanctions. But sanctions have been a failed strategy when it comes to Iran. Some other countries might buckle under the force of US sanctions, but Iran is not any country, and they haven't buckled. And I think that they will be resilient and they will make it through these sanctions. I mean, there will be some negative consequences. So, for example, the Iranian rial further crashed after the announcement of the new sanctions, and now it's at about 200,000 toman to a dollar. So it has lost value, and also I think people's purchasing power, especially for consumer products like cars and home appliances, will decline because of these the new economic warfare. But there will also be some positive consequences. So there are talks that the UAE might cut Iran economically, and UAE has been a hub for shadowy networks and for Iranian capitalists and for segments of the Iranian economy to operate. They operate through the UAE. But if the UAE cuts Iran, then Iran will explore new options. And I think the move towards multipolarity be strengthened, because if Iran goes to neighboring Asian countries that are not the UAE, that are not allied with Israel and the US in the same way, there will be new possibilities for trade relations, and there will be in a way more fuel for the potential move towards multipolarity.
Well, that angle about the UAE is definitely very interesting. And, aside from the fact that the UAE has already announced that they'll cut off trade relations with Iran, Iran does trade with more than 100 countries, as Rania mentioned in the intro. And China, of course, is by far Iran's largest trading partner, taking more than 80% of Iran's seaborne crude oil exports alone, which tells you how much leverage Beijing actually has here and how much this whole strategy really depends on China playing along. So how do you see this playing out globally? Do you think China or Pakistan will actually capitulate here, or is compliance simply against their own interests? We know that China has already released a statement saying that it rejects this economic war, but of course, that's just the first statement. And then, what about the other Arab Gulf states? As I said, the UAE has already halted trade and financial dealings with Iran. But don't the other states in the region still need some working relationship with Iran, given how much they depend on access through Hormuz?
I think they do. And I think your example about China is a very good example because there are some unprecedented things happening when it comes to confronting US sanctions. And China has said that they will not comply with the oil sanctions on Iran, and they will continue to buy Iranian oil. And they even instructed Chinese buyers to buy the oil and ignore the sanctions. And there was this unprecedented ruling by a Chinese high court that penalized a firm in Singapore that had refused to deal with Iran because of US sanctions. So you see that things are changing, and I think countries are becoming less compliant with US sanctions globally, especially because we've seen unprecedented sanctions on Russia after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And these countries are realizing that they cannot do business as usual, and they have to confront the US sanctions because the sanctions are becoming increasingly unilateral and coercive. And what's interesting here, too, is that it also shows the declining power of the US empire and US imperialism because as we all know, a necessary condition for imperialism and being an imperialist power is to have coercive power over the global economy, namely the power of sanctions. And the US has had that for the past, say, 70, 80 years, that if it wants to accomplish a political objective, it imposes sanctions. And this is what separates US from China, because there are some anarchists who claim that China is also an imperialist power. But when you look at the definition of imperialism according to the historical literature, you see that China does not meet the criteria for being an imperialist power. So you can call China what you like, but when it comes to the actual criteria, it doesn't have that coercive power over the global economy. But the US has it, but it is declining because, as we're seeing, China refuses right now to comply with the US sanctions and is continuing to buy Iranian oil.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see how these sort of major players react to all of this, because at the end of the day, these aren't countries that like to be pushed around. I think the US, and this is not to say anything negative about a country like Cuba, for example, but Cuba's in a far weaker position because of where it's geopolitically located and its size than a country like Iran. And I think the US, it's so easy for them to bully a country economically like Cuba. It's also 90 miles away from the US, that they think they can just kind of cookie cutter that kind of strangulation to a far larger country that has a bigger military force and that also has major relations with a country like China. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I want to ask you for an on the ground view here, Navid, because Washington has been ratcheting up the economic pain throughout this war. This is obviously a huge escalation now, but there's already been pain that we've talked about with you throughout this war. So it's been hurting, and you've been there for it. What has that impact actually looked like on the ground, and how are ordinary Iranians reacting to this latest escalation? Is it hardening people's stance against the US, or is there also a kind of fatigue and anger directed at the government, which is what obviously Washington is banking on?
Yeah. I would say it's a little bit of both, but because it is wartime, I would say more of the anger is directed at US and Israel for the war that they initiated. And when it comes to the economic warfare, during the war, I would say it wasn't that, the war happens and, that there's increased economic warfare and people all of a sudden feel more pressure. The sanction regime has been, decades in the making. And as I mentioned, it got intensified under the Obama era before the JCPOA. So the middle classes of Iran have been shrinking because of the sanctions. And I mean, to give you an example from my own experience, is that I remember when I was a kid in, say, the 90s or the 2000s, you would go to people's homes and there was just so much food. You would get overwhelmed with the number of items you would have on the table. And, Iranian hospitality is famous. So you would have, all these nuts and the snacks and fruit on the table. And then when the dinner would come, it would be, 5 different, and there would be, 4 different desserts. But nowadays, in 2026 or even before that, say, for several years now, when you go to people's homes, you're getting less and less, and people's fridges are not as full. So even though the sanctions have not been able to create, say, malnutrition the way they killed thousands of children in Iraq, they have not created malnutrition or economic problems or nutrition problems like that, but they have shrunk the middle classes. So you do see the impact of it. But because of the war, I think the people are united, and they're realizing that they have to show resilience and fight through this until victory.
Navid, in the response from Iran's foreign ministry, they called these sanctions economic terrorism. And we know that Iran, along with other global South countries like China, like Cuba, like Russia, have been condemning Washington's sanctions regimes, which are currently imposed on over 30% of the global population. Can you talk about, what does this broader front against sanctions regimes look like? And given that this is a tool that Washington keeps coming back to, how do global South economies actually make themselves resilient to such measures? We heard Scott Bessent threaten to kick people out of the dollar system. And we know that there have been efforts underway in spaces like the BRICS about de-dollarization, and we know that Russia being kicked out of the SWIFT system was kind of one of the biggest wake-up calls in a lot of ways to the need to explore this other path. So what does that look like in the global South right now? Are there alternative structures being created? And how can these countries make their economies a little more insulated against such measures?
Yeah, so I think alternative structures are kind of in process. So the Iranian leader who was assassinated by US and Israel on February 28th, his entire economic and political philosophy was self-sufficiency and also engagement with the global South and with other countries that are resisting the imperialist system. And same with Raisi, who died under very suspicious circumstances in a helicopter crash. And even with the current Pezeshkian government, even though he's not as pro-global South as Raisi was, he's still further away from the more liberal Rouhani administration. And so they're also trying to build relationship. I think I saw on the presidency site here, Pezeshkian site, that there are even talks about security ties with a country like Burkina Faso, that has a pro-resistance policy, especially against the French. So these things, I think, are in motion. But the problem is that a lot of it thus far remains more an ideal and more an aspiration, as opposed to having a material basis. And I think one problem is that we are mutually colonized. So, people in the global South, they are still colonized in the mind, and also in terms of the human resources and the human networks, because when people want to study here, their first preference is to go to Europe or US or Canada. They're not thinking about, saying, going to Russia or China or global South countries. And I think that's a problem, because if you don't have the human network, it's going to be very difficult to turn these ideas into reality. And I mean, the same historically is true, because when during the early 20th century, when you had the decline and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there were all these ideas to battle colonialism through, say, pan-Islamic unity or pan-Arab unity, and none of that stuff really materials in a serious way. I mean, as you see in 2026, the Muslim countries are not really getting together to fight the US. In fact, all the Arab Gulf states are, in a way, allowing the US to fight against Iran from their soil, and they're not uniting with the Iranians over their shared problems and shared Muslim identity. So a lot of these things remain as ideas, but I think they're in motion. And as US imperialism declines, such as their power over the global economy, I think more of these things will move from the realm of ideas to the realm of reality.